Welcome back to the Dershow. Some important legal developments. The Supreme Court granted review in the TikTok case. Congress passed a statute which would prohibit TikTok essentially from operating in the United States and prevent many, many people who today are on TikTok, millions and millions of people, from having direct access to it. Obviously, there'll be ways of circumventing it, et cetera, but it will make it much more difficult. And the question is whether the First Amendment permits Congress to restrict access to a platform, TikTok, which Congress believes poses national security threats to the United States. It's probably the most important internet social media case that the court will decide. And unfortunately, they put it on a very, very quick track because the law comes into effect in middle or late January. They're going to hear the case in January, requiring briefs to be written quickly over the Christmas holiday, and then a decision to be made very quickly. Hard cases make bad law, and fast cases make bad law. This is too important a case to be put on such a fast track. And I hope the Supreme Court just puts it off and allows full briefing and full argument with amicus briefs. The issues are too important. Remember, there's not only TikTok's First Amendment right, there's your First Amendment right and my First Amendment right to have access to TikTok. The First Amendment operates both ways. The Supreme Court has said that. Speaker has a First Amendment right. The listener has a First Amendment right. Of course, with TikTok, you interact. So there's a close connection between speaker, listener, user. So it's a very, very important case. And I'm just not sure it's going to get the kind of thoughtful consideration that is required for so monumental a case under the First Amendment. A word about South Africa. South Africa is becoming worse and worse. It is one of the most racist, bigoted states in the world today. It's a failed state. It's falling apart. It's economically not viable. It discriminates, obviously, against non-Black people in many, many, many different ways. The same thing is true of some neighboring states. Look, you got to give them a break. They recently came out from under apartheid, but they have moved from being a victim of racism to perpetrators of racism. They, along with Ireland, are the two most anti-Semitic countries today in what we would call the Western world. They hide their anti-Semitism under the label of anti-Zionism, but it's anti-Semitism. Bishop Tutu admitted it. Bishop Tutu didn't like Jews. He was a theological bigot. I mean, he was one of these, the Jews are relegated to hell and kind of stuff. Bishop Tutu was a horrible person, got all kind of Nobel Prizes and all that kind of stuff. And I was once banned from speaking at Wits University in South Africa because I told the truth about Bishop Tutu. Bishop Tutu's answer was, I can't be an anti-Semite. My dentist is a Jew. A typical response of an anti-Semite. He had a lot of typical responses of anti-Semites, and the ANC, which I work with on behalf of Nelson Mandela, has become a neo-Nazi party, and Mandela would be turning over at his grave, and Bishop Tutu would be clapping mightily. It's Bishop Tutu South Africa today, not Nelson Mandela South Africa, and that's a good reason why it's a failed state. Ireland is becoming quickly a failed state for the same reason. The president of Ireland is just an overt anti-Semite. And the prime minister of Israel had the courage to say that. And the president of Ireland responded by saying, but Israel's trying to create settlements in Egypt. In Egypt? Come on. There hasn't been a single Israeli soldier in Egypt. There hasn't been a single effort to have a settlement in Egypt. The man's either an ignoramus or a bigot, or both. You can be both. I'm writing an article now on sanctuary cities, and I'm probably going to have a podcast on it. It's a work in progress. A lot of concerns today. New York State announced today that it is, or at least some legislatures, wants to declare the entire state of New York a sanctuary state. And I have a column coming out which argues that sanctuary cities and states may be unconstitutional under the supremacy clause of the constitutional. And so lots of items in the news today. But let's turn to the subject at hand, the pardon power. Uh, when you read the Constitution of the United States, as I've read it hundreds of times, and I've read the debates over the Constitution as well, the thing that stands out as remarkable is the pardon power. The pardon power is the only remnant, really the major remnant of kingly rule in England. Um, we fought a revolution against Great Britain, and we won. And the Constitution was written, much of it in reaction to our winning the revolution. For example, our system of separation of powers and checks and balances is exactly the opposite of Britain, which has none of that. Britain is a parliamentary system. Technically, the king rules, but the king is a figurehead, less so with King George, but certainly so today with King Charles, and certainly with Queen Elizabeth, figureheads. And by the way, Queen Elizabeth was no great person. She too had a lot of bigotry and anti-Semitism. In all of her years, she never once went to Israel. Her husband did, because her husband's parents, or mother at least, is buried there. And King Charles is very pro Israel and very friendly with the Jewish community. But Elizabeth had nothing but contempt for Jews and nothing but contempt for Israel, and very, very overrated as a queen. She lived a long time, yeah, but not and she lived, a good life, but she was an ignorant woman and a woman with a lot of personal bigotry. The Windsor family has a horrible history, of course. They were Germans, and many of them supported the Nazis, and one of them abdicated because he supported the Nazis. So, don't give me, stuff about Queen Elizabeth. I'm not a fan. I am a fan of King Charles, but not of Queen Elizabeth. So, getting back to the pardon power, the remnant of British royalty, it's the opposite of checks and balances, the opposite of separation of powers, and the opposite of democracy. Let me read to you from the Constitution. This is Article 2 of the Constitution, and it lists all the duties of the president and all the powers of the president, and almost all of them are subject to checks. For example, he shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the Senate. Throughout the Constitution, you find that. That's why America has such a hard time moving forward sometimes and doing things, because there are so many checks and so many balances. For example, you can't declare war without the approval of Congress. So presidents have figured out a way of circumventing it. They don't go to war. They just have military actions, like in Korea or Vietnam. But there are wars, of course, and in Iraq. So they've circumvented the Constitution, but there's no way of circumventing the pardon power. The pardon power is absolute. Here's what it says. He, the president, shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. That's important, except in cases of impeachment. But the rest of it is without any limitation. Shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. So he can't pardon President Trump, for example, for the New York case. That's not an offense against the United States, although one can argue that some issues in the case involved offenses against the United States. Several of the multiple choice jury instructions involved offenses against the United States, but I don't think he can pardon. But for anything else, he can pardon. And there are no restrictions. And the Supreme Court has no authority to rule on pardons. And there are very few Supreme Court cases on pardons. There's one, 1912, I think, Biddle versus Petrovich, written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, which says that a person receiving a pardon has no power to reject it. Getting a pardon is like getting a communicable disease. You can't just reject it. If you don't like it, you can say, I don't like it. You can say you reject it, but it has no impact A pardon is something which is given by the president, and that's the end of it. And it doesn't even say that a pardon can be revoked if it's the product of bribery. There are no cases on that, and maybe a court would say that it's not a valid pardon if it was a subject of bribery. But short of bribery, there's almost nothing that can't be done under the presidential power to reprieve and pardon. In addition to pardons, of course, the president can commute a sentence. In fact, most acts of presidential clemency are commutations rather than full pardons. Biden got a full pardon. Wow, what a pardon he got, going back to the day he was born practically, and continuing till the day he dies. You can't pardon anybody for crimes that haven't yet been committed, although who knows if some president tried to do that. But the common wisdom is that no, it can be done for any crimes. In the past, they don't have to have been charged. Richard Nixon wasn't charged with any crime. He wasn't accused of any time. He wasn't indicted. And President Ford said, well, magic, magic, magic. You're pardoned for anything you might have done against the United States ever in the past. And that was thought to have two results. Number one, it helped heal the country after Watergate. Number two, it resulted in Ford losing an election to an extraordinarily weak opposing candidate, Jimmy Carter. So the pardon power is political. I mean, you can oppose somebody who pardoned. You can say, I'll never vote for Biden because he pardoned his son, or I'll never vote for Trump because he pardoned whoever. But that's a political response to a constitutionally permissible decision. You can criticize a president for acting under the Constitution, but you can't deny him the power to do so. And so, the question is, could Congress restrict the power to pardon in some way? Probably not. Probably not. The power seems pretty absolute. The congressional debates, not much about pardons. There were some people who were opposed to it as a remnant of the power of the king. The king can pardon, and people always, oh, nothing's above the law. Pardons are above the law. They're part of the law. They are the law. But the way in which a president acts pursuant to the pardon power is above the law. He can't be reviewed. Nobody can go to the court and say, hey, you can't pardon your son. That's unconstitutional. What if Biden were to try to pardon himself, or Trump were to try to pardon himself? Could somebody go to court and challenge that? Now, there is no case law on that subject. During the debates, there was some discussion about whether any government agent, president, anybody else, can constitutionally act on his own behalf, or whether there is an inherent conflict of interest between serving the people of the country and, satisfying your own needs. And if you can't act on your own behalf, can you act on your son's behalf? Those are hard questions. No president has ever pardoned himself, and I doubt that we'll see in the years to come a president pardoning himself. But if he did, my prediction is the courts would not interfere. When I say not interfere, I'm not saying they would uphold it. I'm not saying they would say it was right. They would probably just stay away from it. Deny review, deny certiorari, say we have no jurisdiction over a presidential act of pardon. The president can do what he wants, and he has to pay the political consequences the way President Ford did. Excuse me. So, bottom line, bringing it to contemporary matters, what can we expect in the next 20 some odd days from the current president? Remember who the current president is? This guy named Biden. Remember him? He used to be the president. Oh, he still is the president. You wouldn't know it. If you ask anybody in the world today, who's the president of the United States, they'll tell you it's Donald Trump. He's the guy who went to Paris to Notre Dame. He's the one who's meeting every day with world leaders, talking on the phone with world leaders. What's Biden doing? He's pardoning people. And there's some questionable pardons. There's been a lot of controversy Even Governor Shapiro, loyal Democrat, criticized one of the pardons of a judge who apparently was taking money to put kids in prison, in private prisons. Pretty horrible thing, but yeah, he pardoned him. You can criticize it, as Shapiro rightly did, but you can't undo it. Um, and so, what are we going to see? Are we going to see Biden pardon himself? No, I don't think so. Are we going to see him pardon his brother? I don't know, but I would bet against it. I think he has exhausted his family pardons. He certainly went a long way with family pardons, and he's now pardoned a lot of people, not nearly as many as other presidents have in the past. And there doesn't seem to be much of a pattern. He did pardon a lot of people who got home confinement based on COVID. But there doesn't seem to be a rhyme. When President Trump pardoned the last time around, many of the pardons fit into a category that I actually advised President Trump on. We had a phone call. We talked about it. I told him about what I thought was a terrible thing, namely the trial penalty. I mentioned this before, where you get many, many, many more years in prison for going to trial than you would have if you waived your right to trial. And just like I don't think the person can be rewarded for waiving his right to vote, I'm not sure you should be able to be rewarded as much as you are rewarded today for not going to trial, for waiving your right to trial. One of the cases I recommended a pardon to President Trump, and he granted it. Not a pardon, a commutation, I'm sorry, were two guys who had been offered, I think, 7 years in prison if they pleaded guilty, and they got 75 years after they went to trial and were found not guilty. And President Trump was outraged at that, as any legitimate person should be outraged. Maybe you can argue for, a double or 10% more or 30% more, but 10 times the amount, from 7 to 75, almost 11 times the amount, for not waiving your right to go to trial. That seemed too much, and that was part of the process. And there are theories, and I think President Trump will also pardon people who he thinks were subject to warfare, political partisan warfare. He has indicated already that he might pardon Eric Adams, the mayor of New York. We talked about that a little bit. If he believes that Eric Adams was a subject of political persecution because of his views on sanctuary cities and on the borders and on deportations or anything else. I know he did even last time pardon some people who he thought were selectively prosecuted based on their being Republicans or being Trump supporters or whatever. I'm not here to sit in judgment over particular cases, but I certainly understand the principle in which a president would pardon if he felt the people he was pardoning were politically prosecuted under the Stalin Lavrenti Beria notion, show me the man and I'll find you the crime. Trump himself, of course, was and is such a victim. His case in New York is clearly a case of unconstitutional, selective, and unequal protection. Nobody is ever prosecuted for not disclosing hush money payment on a corporate form. Why would anybody ever pay a hush money payment if they had to disclose it on a corporate form? It's the most absurd case. And President Biden, if he was smart, he couldn't. He doesn't have the power to pardon him, but maybe he could make a phone call to the Democratic governor of New York and urge the Democratic governor of New York to pardon President Trump for what is not a crime at all. And President Trump would probably say, I reject the pardon because I didn't commit a crime at all, but it would have no impact. He would have a pardon and he wouldn't have a sentence hanging over his head for 4 years. We've talked about that. You know my views. It's unconstitutional for a judge, a lower court New York judge, to have the power to hold a sentence over the head of a sitting president and potentially use that as an extortionate threat against the president to do what he wants him to do, for fear that otherwise the president will be punished by the judge if he's sentenced after he stops being president. So, there are many, many problems with the pardon power. It's an exception in the Constitution. It some respects, is, as I say, a remnant of divine kingly authorities that a king, a president, a governor. By the way, in many states, governors don't have the untrammeled power to pardon. They can recommend a pardon to the pardon board, or they can pardon only with the approval of the pardon board, or there are other restrictions. But under the federal constitution, anything goes. A president can pardon, commute, and in any way constrain the sentence. He can partially commute. He can commute the prison time part of it, but not the fine. He can, pardon one count of an indictment, not another count. There's literally no restrictions on what a president can do. So we'll see. We'll see what happens in the next month or 3 weeks or so. And then we'll see what happens on January 20th. President Trump has already said he intends to pardon the January 6th people. As you know, I have a January 6th defendant, a young man, a law school graduate, wonderful young man who just went. I disagree with what he did, but he went to protest the election. He thought it wasn't fair. I think it was fair. And then he was waved into the House of Representatives, I think it was, by the police. And he went in, stayed there a few minutes, didn't do any damage, left. And then he was denied his law degree, denied admission to the bar, and faces criminal charges. And I'm hoping he will be pardoned along with all other non-violent January 6th defendants. It would be good, perhaps, if Biden did that, but he's not going to. So let's see how pardons play out during the end of the Biden administration, during the beginning of the Trump administration. I'll keep an eye on it. You keep an eye on it, and I'll report on it if warranted. Okay. Letters. I got so many letters about whether Jesus was a Jew. Virtually all of them point to Luke and point to various provisions of the Bible, the Christian Bible, which indicate that, of course, he was a Jew, was born in Judea, and was a descendant of King David. But the best line was from the great comedian Robin Williams, who I miss all the time. I actually met Robin Williams when he was in Boston doing a stand-up comedy act. He apparently knew about me or something, and he asked me to come behind into the dressing room, and I spent an hour with him. He was hysterically funny, and when he died, I was so sad. Well, here's a riff. You can get it online. Just put in Robin Williams, Jesus was a Jew. And I'm not going to try to imitate Robin Williams, but he said, of course Jesus was a Jew. How can anybody doubt that? He lived at home with his parents until he was 30. His mother thought he was God. He went into his father's business. Of course he was Jewish. Now, I don't know whether that joke is more anti-Jewish or more anti-Christian, but it's funny as hell. So I'm going to tell it. You got to have a sense of humor, especially if you have a joke that equally is offensive to some Jews and some Christians. I'm going to tell it. Don't feel offended by it. I have a lot of respect for Jesus. As I say, I taught the New Testament in one of my classes on the biblical sources of justice. I think Jesus' teaching is fantastic. He was, of course, a great rabbi, too. And the Jefferson Bible, which is one of the most wonderful documents, Thomas Jefferson, by hand, went through the New Testament and eliminated what he regarded as the miracles and kept in the teachings of Jesus. That now is the official Bible of the Unitarian Church. Obviously, it's not an official Bible of the Christians, because Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, all Christianity includes miracles. Jefferson didn't believe in miracles and didn't believe in many of the parts of the both New and Old Testament. He was very critical also of the Old Testament, as was many people during the Enlightenment were very critical of biblical teachings, and so Jesus was a Jew. Of course, he was a Jew. He was born a Jew, and he died a Jew. And as one letter says, you cannot understand Jesus without understanding his Jewish roots. You know, we know that there were the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of those were all Jews. They were Jews arguing with each other about, how to interpret the Bible. And there was some, rich and some poor, but it was all about Jews. The whole New Testament is about Jews, except the part that's about the Romans. And Paul was Saul, and all the disciples were Jewish, and so Judas has a Jewish name, not a good disciple, but nonetheless a disciple. Actually, there's a really good novel written about Judas. I forget who's by, maybe Amos Oz, but I don't remember. One of the great writers wrote a great novel about Judas and portraying him in a somewhat different light. In any event, Jesus was a Jew, and Christianity has its source in Judaism, as does Islam. If you read the Quran and you follow the Sharia law, you'll see so much of it derives from Christianity, derives from Judaism. That's why we call the three of them the Abrahamic religions. They all have their source in Abraham and his two children, his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And, you can't just pull them apart and separate them. Okay, a lot of letters got it wrong, but a lot of letters got it right. This continues along that line. I don't know what's wrong with people. I'm a Christian, always have been a Christian. Jesus was a Jew. I grew up in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood in a very large city. They were always very kind and helpful to our family. We helped each other all the time when needed. My best friends were mostly Jews. I learned about their religion. They learned about mine. I don't understand the hatred. I don't understand the hatred either. Okay, a funny letter. You handled the interruption well. I have to explain that. So I was at an event last night that Ben Shapiro was speaking at, and a number of other people, friends of mine, were there. Miriam Adelson was there, and I was being auctioned off for a lunch. I don't know how much they got from me, but the initial bid was $5,000. I hope it went up more. I don't know, but I think I'm worth $5,000. Interesting lunch. Any event, I was there, and I had to take time out to do the show while I was at the event. And the owner of the house gave me his office, and we closed the door. Somebody just wandered in and start walking around, and he got into the shot. And finally I had to say, look, excuse me, sir, I'm doing a show. And finally he walked out. But you handled the interruption well. What I did it the best I could. It wasn't perfect. Okay. It's completely unconscionable that Merchant can attempt to suspend judgment for 4 years while blocking effective appeal or legal remedy on the part of the defendant. There must be a legal remedy available to secure an appeal and censure Merchant for his abysmal ruling. I think there is, and I think it will be tried if he tries to pull that shtick and get around the law. How can a gag order remain in place for a president? It can't. And I don't know why the Supreme Court denied review of the case, but they did. And so technically, there's a gag order on the president of the United States. Everybody should have free speech rights, but surely the president has a bully pulpit, and you shouldn't have any gag order on him. Okay, here's one. That's an interesting one. This will be the final question. All right, Alan, guns and the easy availability of cars has a direct bearing on how many people are killed by cars. Yes, of course. The more cars there are in a country, the more people will be killed by cars. That's all I'm saying. The more guns there are that are easily available, the more people will be killed by guns. It's almost a tautology. Why do you fight with it? Now, the argument in response is cars are important. Yeah, and the argument on the other side is, and guns are important if you think they are, and they're protected by the Second Amendment. Cars aren't protected by the Second Amendment. And so it's an interesting argument what to do about it, but don't deny the relationship between the easy availability of millions and millions and millions of guns and the high rate of gun murder in the United States. That's just a fact. And, you can argue with it. And maybe someday science will prove me wrong. But right now, I think the facts are on my side. In any event, it has nothing to do with what you should do about it. That's a different issue. And the Second Amendment imposes constraints on what we can do about it. And I support the Second Amendment just the way I support the First Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and the Sixth Amendment. See you next week.